Thank you so much for clicking on my video, and if you're returning, welcome back to my channel. Today we continue our recap of Diana, Her True Story in Her Own Words by Andrew Morton. So let's get into it. Once again, thank you so much for clicking on my video. If you have not already, feel free to go ahead and like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on that notification bell. I want to say a big hello to all of the subscribers, the viewers, and the members from YouTube and Patreon, and I'm going to curtsy to the royal court and the kings and queens. Thank you so much for all that you do. Now today, we are getting into Diana, Her True Story in Her Own Words by Andrew Morton. And I actually have two versions of this book. This is the 25th edition, or the 25th anniversary edition. And the cool thing about this is that since it's retrospective, they provide the transcripts and they provide that in narrated form. So it gives a little bit more of a personal feel. Now, of course, this was done well after Diana had since passed away. And so it's not Diana's voice in the same way that Spare was narrated by Prince Harry in the audio version. However, it is it's just a nice touch. And although it's very different, it's obviously not Diana's voice. It doesn't even sound like Diana. After a while, you kind of get past that and you just kind of get wrapped up in the story. So if you don't have the audio version, I highly recommend, because they provide the transcripts that were used to write the book. And that's actually where they start you off. They start you with the transcripts and then you get into the book by Andrew Morton. It is such a well done project. And I wanted to recap this version versus the just actual book because it gives so much more depth and a lot more detail. Now, this was done in the early 90s, and this was written from Diana's perspective at that point. She was still married to Charles. Things were still very divided in her family between her and her father and her stepmother. She had a relationship with her mom at the time, but that was a bit strained. And at the time, both her sons were children, and she and her husband were still married. So, and the queen was still alive, obviously. So this book is written from that perspective. Now, one of the things I want to do at the end of this recap is I want to dedicate a video, maybe part 1 and part 2, because it'll probably be pretty long, to give a retrospective look back to where Diana was when this book was written with each individual person, and then talk about what eventually happened up until the time of her passing, and maybe a little bit of detail after. That way we can get into some of the things, like in the book, she and her stepmother Rain were still very estranged, but after the book was written, after Diana neared the end of her marriage to Charles, things changed. At the time that the book was written, she and her father were a bit estranged, and they were working things out. That eventually changed, and her relationship with Charles even changed. And so things were different after the book was released, as well as the fallout from the book itself, which we got a view of that in the foreword. But I do want to, at the end of this recap, do a little look back, part 1 and part 2, so that we can talk about what happened post book and where those relationships eventually evolved into. So just saying that now, because I know that it'll probably be pretty tempting to add, like, well, actually what ended up happening. And I want to keep things as central to the actual portion of the book we're talking about, so that the comments are a little bit more relevant to what we're talking about at each time. We have time to get to everything. So just letting you know, we will do that. So,
disclaimer. The recap series of Diana, Her True Story, is focused solely on the published work. The nature of this series is to recap the work and share my opinion. I will not dispute the author or participants' first-hand experience as shared in this work. I am merely observing and providing my own opinion.
We start off this portion of the book with Diana's early childhood. Diana was an aristocrat, her family was noble, and she was born at home, not at a hospital, which I thought was very interesting, and I'll tell you why at the end. Diana was the child of divorced parents, and she gave us insight into why her family eventually split apart. So All this time, anytime I'd heard someone say that Diana's parents were divorced, I'd heard that it was because her mother ran off with Peter Shan Kidd. And that's kind of the story that took hold. And that's kind of true. But again, nuance. Multiple things can be true at once. Yes, she did meet Peter Shan Kidd, which we get a little view of here. But yes, they did eventually marry, but her father was very abusive to her mom, and her mom was very depressed while married to her dad. She described her mom as always crying. Anytime the kids had to leave the house, her mother would throw cry fits because she didn't want them to leave. And Diana described her mother Frances, as essentially putting very heavy weights on the kids. Anytime they had to leave the house, she would be like, I don't want you to leave. And she would be so sorrowful. And for 8 and 9-year-olds, this was tough on Diana and her little brother, Charles. So we kind of get a glimpse of that, and we'll get there. So let me not skip ahead. Diana's birth was not welcome. And you'll see that thread of disappointment follow her entire life as being an unwanted child. Now, eventually things obviously ironed out. But when you've essentially been told and been shown that you aren't valued, that can mess with your self-esteem. And the reason Diana wasn't necessarily wanted was because she was the 3rd child, and prior to her, there were 2 daughters. Now, before she was born, there was a son that was born, and his name was John, after her father, John Spencer. Her father wanted another son because he wanted someone to carry on the family name. So he wanted a son, and he had John, and John died 10 hours after birth. Diana described this baby as a baby her parents were crazy about. They wanted this little boy so bad. They already had 2 daughters. They had a 3rd child. It was time for the family name to be carried on. They knew they would need a boy, and he died 10 hours after birth. So they were so close to having everything they wanted in that complete family, and he passed away. So they tried again, and they got a 3rd child, but it was Diana, another girl. And they were so upset about this and disappointed about this that they didn't even name Diana for a whole week. Now, eventually, obviously, they fell in love with Diana, and they got very close with her, and they treated her like all the other kids. But there's something about that origin that you see follow her throughout the entire book. You see Diana consistently describe not feeling a sense of belonging anywhere. She never felt accepted or belonging anywhere. Here's the thing. She was very popular in school. At one point, she was even a bully by her own admission, which that story is kind of funny, but we'll get there. She was even somewhat of a bully. She was a class clown. People loved her. She was very much a people person, but that's an external personality. But inside, she never felt like she quite belonged. We'll get there. Eventually, her parents divorced. Diana described her parents' marriage as being extremely tumultuous, with her dad being very cold and at times very mean. And she even saw him slap her mother Frances, across the face. Now, it's interesting that that's something she saw with her own eyes and wrote in her book in the early 90s. But when you still look up, why did Frances and John divorce? It's because Frances met Peter Shan Kidd and ran away. That's the story. See how she caught all the blame? And not only was that pretty controversial that they divorced, Diana was one of the first, if not the first kid, her and her brother, in their school to have divorced parents. Another element to them feeling unwelcome and not belonging. She also explains that Charles, her little brother, also felt that same not belonging everywhere he went. She said out of all her siblings, her 2 sisters and her baby brother, that Charles was the one that was the most like her. And as she described it, he would be doomed to always feeling set apart and as if he didn't belong. She described her older sisters as always being somewhat detached. Now, there's a reason for that. Charles and Diana are closer in age. Her older sisters have a little bit of an age gap, and they were away at prep school during most of the fallout of their parents' marriage. So they didn't see a lot of that firsthand. And when they came home during the holidays, there was somewhat of a more of a welcome wagon that they experienced. And so people were just happy to have them home. So they never really felt the effects of like that day to day, because they only came home during celebration times during the holiday. When their parents did divorce, they would come home and there would be a nanny. But again, they're much older. They don't need a nanny. So this all mostly affected Diana and Charles. Speaking of her siblings coming home, Diana described just adoring her oldest sister and at times taking great pleasure in doing all the things for her older sister, running her bath water, turning down her bed, doing all of her laundry, unpacking her things from school. And she describes this labor almost as acts of kindness, as her love language towards her sister. And she did acknowledge that maybe that wasn't the best idea to do that for her sister, because in some ways she was kind of idolizing her sister, and maybe that wasn't the best idea. We'll get there in the book where she dissects why that wasn't the best idea, but right now she kind of leaves us in the dark, and there's a little bit of mystery, like, did her sister exploit this adoration?
I idolized my eldest sister, and I used to do all her washing when she came back from school, packed her suitcase, ran her bath, made her bed, the whole lot. I did it all, and I thought it was wonderful. I soon learned that doing that wasn't such a good idea.
This doesn't make her sister a bad person. That's really common. Older siblings are typically idolized and admired by their younger siblings. We typically think our older siblings are so cool and just the coolest people ever. And we just want to be friends with them and we want to be like them. And sometimes we can do that. Me and my sister used to play restaurant. And so, and during the summer, she would be like, waitress, I need a hot dog. And I would have to get up from whatever I was doing and go like make her a hot dog and a drink. She would never pay me. She was the cheapest customer ever. And eventually I threw her out of my establishment because I never got paid. So, but because she was my older sister, I loved doing that kind of stuff for her. And looking back, it's just funny because she didn't exploit it over time. It was just like something that she would do. And if I didn't want to do it, I'd be like, I'm off work, I'm on break. Now, Diana gives us a lot more insight into her parents' relationship and how even after the divorce, prior to the divorce and after the divorce, the divide was so strong that it traumatized the kids. She gives us insight into this one story where her cousin gets married and they ask Diana to be in the wedding. And at the rehearsal, they ask everyone to dress in a smart dress. So her dad buys her a white dress and her mom buys her a green dress. And they were both lovely dresses. But Diana saw picking a dress as if she were picking a side. She had a meltdown. She doesn't even remember which dress she eventually picked. And this is an example of when I say when you have a blended family and you rely on the children to communicate between the parents, not only is that selfish and immature, not only is it extremely detrimental to the family unit as a whole, but it's traumatizing for the kids. If you have to rely on the child to communicate their needs, but you don't communicate with the child's other parent, you aren't doing all that you can. If you aren't able to communicate with your child's other parent and you make that difficult for them to the point that they feel like I can only talk to my child about my child's needs, it takes two people coming together to do what's best for the kid. You will never get a fully informed, well-rounded view of the status of your child from the child because they're a child. Most kids can't even assess or determine their own needs. If you ask a child, how's everything going? They'll say, good. But if you ask their parent and you're the other parent, they may say, well, we're working on them getting more consistent with responsibilities around the house. I need you to help out with that when they're there for the weekend. A child isn't going to tell you, I got in trouble because I didn't wash the dishes and mom said that's my new chore. But the parent would be able to tell you that, and you would be able to reinforce it on your side. Also, even in high school, I know a lot of people are like, well, once they're a certain age, they can communicate on their own. Wrong. Even in high school, first of all, high school is overwhelming for a lot of people. High school has a lot going on. If you talk to your child throughout high school, but you don't talk to their other parent, you're going to miss a lot of the things that they need because one, that shouldn't be their responsibility to communicate with that with you. It should be the other parent. So if you call and say, hey, how's everything going? And they just say, good, then things are good. But if you call their parent, they may say, well, it's time to pay for the class ring. It's time to pay for prom. It's time to pay for graduation. We're going to give them a limo. So this is the cost of that. Do you want to split it? Like they would be able to commune with you. So allowing the child to participate or be the communicator when parenting them, that can be detrimental. There's a way to incrementally involve them over time so that they take on more responsibility and they can begin to speak for themselves. But you should always vie to communicate with the other parent so that you can properly provide a well-rounded experience for the child and the weight of their own parenting and your split and divide isn't on their shoulders. Just wanted to segue into that because I hear a lot of parents saying, well, when they're old enough, they'll call me and tell me they need things. Wrong. That doesn't always happen. You need to talk to the other parent. You had a baby with them. You should be able to get through a conversation. And if you can't, counseling. That's all I got to say about that. Let's move on. This divide does not end in Diana's childhood. This is actually shown throughout her entire life that she lived with her parents never quite getting along, and her father's spouse being a huge contributor to the divide in the family as a whole, and her mother's spouse not really wanting to get involved because he didn't do the drama thing. So she also shows us a glimpse into her Christmases. Diana spent her Christmases at Sandringham. So when she lived in Norfolk, her father would send them over to Sandringham because he never wanted to disrespect the Queen. If the kids were invited, he made sure they got there, and they would go over and hang out with the Queen's children at Christmas time, and they would watch Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And she described, at the time that this was published, she said they had watched Chitty Chitty Bang Bang 3 years in a row. Diana was over it. She hated Christmas at Sandringham. She knew the Queen from the time that she was a very young child, and so the Queen, she respected her, but it wasn't someone that she like feared. It was just she was used to communing with the Queen and the Queen's children, so she was very comfortable in that atmosphere. But she hated going over there for Christmas. She didn't like it. Every time they tried to get her to go over, she would kick and scream, and at times fight. She hated going over there. Sandringham proved to be that experience for Diana even as an adult. Now, Diana shared something else of particular interest to me. Again, I'm going to make the connection at the end of this video. Diana hated nannies. That comes up again in Spare. We find out that Diana hated William and Harry's nanny, Tiggy, and I'll tell you why. But in the moment, we're going to talk about her nannies. Now, here's the thing about her own nannies. She said that her life can be described post her parents' divorce as a revolving door of nannies. And she was a big contributor to that, but here's why. She never felt like they were there to actually take care of the children. They were there.
We had so many changes of nannies because Daddy was a very attractive divorcee and he was good bait for somebody. We tend to think they came for that rather than for looking after my brother and I. We always thought they were a threat because they tried to take Mother's position. They were all very young and rather pretty. They were chosen by my father. It was terribly disruptive to come back from school one day and find a new nanny.
They were there to try and replace her mother. They wanted to marry her father. Her father was rich, he was noble, and he was handsome and young. And they wanted to be the next wife. Her father was a big contributor to that as well because he would hire young and beautiful women. But I don't know that there was a big focus on their capabilities or their relationship with the children. It was more so focused on, I want this pretty young thing around the house. And Diana and the other children picked up on that real quick. And so what Diana would do and her siblings, they would put pins in the nannies' chairs. They would throw their clothes out of the window. She said that they were pretty atrocious to the nannies because the nannies weren't there for them. And it was quite evident the nannies were there to get a husband. And she did not appreciate that. And I found that to be interesting because later down the line, when we read Spare, Tiggy was hired by Charles to care for William and Harry, and Diana did not like Tiggy because she felt like Tiggy was trying to replace her. And Tiggy was invited to Harry's wedding and to Princess Meghan, so we do know that they maintain their strong relationship, but Diana doesn't have a strong history of liking nannies, and I can understand that because it was always done in some way. It looked deceitful. Now, Diana brings us back to that comment, or the consistent comments, that she never felt like she belonged. She always felt like the spare. Harry was the literal spare in the royal family, but Diana described feeling like the spare in her own family because her older brother John died when he was 10 months old, and her parents wanted him to carry on the family name. And when she was born, it was more so like, what a disappointment. This is the third daughter. They can't carry on the family name. What is going to happen? So she always felt like the replacement child and not the wanted child. Now, another little fact, she did not do well in school. She talks about her time at Riddlesworth Hall. Now, she loved school, but she didn't do well. And while she was there, she said she felt pretty rejected. And the reason is she wanted to stay home and help her father around the house. She wanted to stay and be there for him because this was post-divorce. And during her breaks, she would take care of her dad in the household, or at least help out. And when she went away to school, she felt like she felt rejected, she felt discarded, and she also felt like she wasn't making the best use of her time. She wanted to be with her dad. And you start to see this revelation that she's kind of a daddy's girl, and she's very protective of her dad and her household, and she wanted to be there. But it kind of was a distraction to her in school because she couldn't fully focus. She also described hating school. The only subject that she really liked was history. Really liked the athletic side. She was a swimmer, which we see that in Harry. He quick to take off them clothes and hop in a body of water all through Spare. That's what he's doing the whole time. And I found it funny that Diana won awards for her diving and for her swimming. She also described her time at school as being a naughty girl. Like, she said she was naughty. She pulled pranks. She snuck out after hours. She got in trouble once for this whole story is messed up. But at one point she got in a lot of trouble because she snuck out of school and left the campus, which is a big no-no. But this is something that a lot of the girls did. Now, when they did it, the other girls, they were doing it to meet with boys. When Diana did it, it was a prank. She was just sneaking out. But the reason she got caught and the other girls didn't is because the one night that she sneaks out, her roommate or someone in her hall gets appendicitis. And the reason that is such a big deal is because the handlers didn't notice if someone was missing because they weren't doing bed checks at that time. But since someone in her hall got appendicitis, they come in, they check all the girls, and they're like, wait, where's Diana? And they tell that she left the campus. Now, she was put up to this prank by some of the girls who also told on her. So it was kind of messed up. But here's what's funny. At this point, her parents are divorced. And so the school calls her parents because they're like, Diana's in trouble. She snuck off campus in the middle of the night. And so her parents go through the whole rigmarole like, oh, wow, okay, we'll handle it. Thank you so much for letting us know. And then when they got her alone, her dad was like, I didn't think you had it in you. And her parents were cracking up laughing. They were like, Diana got caught. Like, this is one of the better stories that she shares because it kind of shows this dynamic. Like, not only was Diana like a little mischievous, so were her parents. It also kind of gave insight into how they probably connected and how they probably fell in love, because at the point in which the book is written, she's sharing her story from the point that their relationship is falling apart. But when you hear this story of how they connected over Diana's mischievous nature, you kind of hear a little glimpse into like, oh, that's probably how they got together. They probably had a lot in common when it came to that youth and that little like need to be naughty. I thought that was a funny story. But when she describes the girl who caught appendicitis, which eventually led to her getting in trouble, she was completely unforgiving to this girl for getting appendicitis. It was so funny. In the book, she's like, and this random girl gets appendicitis, like, oh, boo freaking who? I'm trying to sneak out, girl. Can you wait a minute? She's so impatient with this girl and this appendicitis. Like, nothing is worse than Diana getting caught, not this thing rupturing in this young girl's stomach. So that whole portion of the book was pretty funny. So now we get to the point in which Diana meets Rain. Rain is Diana's stepmother. She is the woman who eventually married John Spencer. And at this point, her grandfather dies. They move to Althorpe. Her dad is now the Earl Spencer. And at this point, he marries Rain, but Diana did not trust Rain. She described Rain as strategic and in some way conniving because she always put herself in the right place at the right time. She said Rain would always just happen to show up. They would be out to lunch as a family and Rain would just run into them out of nowhere. They would be on a trip or something like that and Rain would just happen to be there. Now, listening to this story, I don't know how much of this is Rain bumping into them versus her, John, Diana's dad, and Rain cooperating for Rain to just kind of dip in and see the kids, but they both planned for Rain to be in those places so that they could see each other. I don't know, but I thought it was interesting because she basically described Rain as a woman with an agenda. She had her father in her crosshairs and she wanted to marry him.
Right, and life took a very big turn because my stepmother, Rain, appeared on the scene, supposedly incognito. She used to sort of join us, accidentally find us in places and come and sit down and pour us with presents, and we all hated her so much because we thought she was going to take Daddy away from us. But actually, she was suffering from the same thing. She was very clever and she wanted to marry Daddy. That was her target. and that was it.
Here's what's messy. Miss Rain was married at the time that she met John Spencer and started showing up and popping up. So Miss Rain had a husband since the time she was 18 years old. She had already married, and her husband was noble as well. But when she met John Spencer, honey, all that went out the window, and we will get there. We'll get there. So who is Rain? So Rain is the Countess Spencer, and she was a British socialite and a local politician. She was the daughter of Alexander McCorquodale. Her mother was a romantic novelist and socialite named Barbara Cartland. Rain was married 3 times total, once before Diana's dad. Then Diana's dad, John Spencer, was her second husband, and then she remarried after John Spencer died. She eventually had 5 titles throughout her entire life. They included Honorable Mrs. Gerald Legge, Viscountess Lewisham, Countess of Dartmouth, Countess Spencer, and Comtesse de Chambrun. She left her first marriage after getting involved with Diana's father. And it's interesting that the narrative about Frances, who is Diana's mother, is that she met Peter Shan Kidd and ran off into the abyss with him. They never really talk about John Spencer being abusive to her physically and in other ways. But with her stepmother, Rain, who actually did cheat on her first husband and met John Spencer and left her first husband for John Spencer, that narrative is never really out there. Diana and her siblings did not like Rain at first. She said they didn't like her so much that they wouldn't even meet her gaze. Like, they would not look her in the eye. They were quite awful to her. They called her Acid Rain, and when she was around, they would often sing, "Rain, rain, go away." And the reason was because she said Rain would buy them gifts and try to win them over with like financial means, but it was never really genuine. And it reminded me of the story in Spare when Harry talks about how Camilla meeting William for the first time was not only leaked to the press, but it was like really strategic and really intentionally done because she knew that he was the future heir. And if he didn't get along with her, then it might not be likely that she would eventually marry Charles. So she played her cards right. But when it was time to meet Harry, who really didn't have an effect on her future at all, he said that she just basically showed up, got it over with, and left. And it's that description that reminds me of how Diana describes Rain meeting John Spencer's kids. It's just so crazy how history keeps cycling around. Anyway, so eventually all of this culminated in their adulthood when Charles, Diana's younger brother, gets married, and Diana is there. And again, she and her dad they get along, but she doesn't really get along with his wife. But because Charles, her baby brother, is the one getting married, her mother, Frances, is also in attendance. And while they were going through the whole rigmarole around the wedding, prior to the wedding day, after the wedding, all those events, she described Rain and her father, John, as being very awful towards her mother. They wouldn't speak to her mother. Even when they were on the same pew, they would not talk to her mom. Rain was quite rude and disgusting to her mom. So Diana confronted Rain. She was like, at the end of the day, my brother's getting married. You need to be polite. You need to show my mom some respect. Her son is the one that's getting married. And as she's saying this, Rain cuts her off, and Rain is like, actually, you don't know what kind of pain your mother put your father through. Ma'am, you know what? And I understand now Diana's reaction. You do not talk about a marriage you were not in. You have no idea what your current husband went through with his first wife, because you don't know his first wife like that, and you damn sure don't know her kids better than she does. That's why when you are the second, third, fourth, fifth wife, whatever, you keep your focus on what's going on at hand. You cannot speak for the person that was there before you, and you cannot speak to who your husband was to his other spouses because you weren't there. People usually develop in other ways after their marriages or relationships end, and they grow, and they're a completely different partner to the partners that follow. So you can't sit here and say, and y'all, this is in the 80s, I'm still getting mad. You can't sit here and say, well, your father was really hurt by your mom. Yeah, but did you know he slapped her across the face? So Diana's pissed, and she was like, who are you to tell me what my mom did or didn't do? So at this point, Diana's the Princess of Wales, and she says, do you know the type of pain I see in my line of work? I see people who are actually in pain. I see people who are on their deathbed. I see people who are in poverty. You wouldn't know the first thing about pain. And so she said at that point, she decided to share every grievance her whole family had about Rain with Rain.
So I took it upon myself to air everyone's grievances in my family. My father didn't speak to me for 6 months. Rain doesn't speak to me now. But I stuck up for Mummy, and my mother said that was the first time in 22 years anyone had ever stuck up for her. I said everything I possibly could. I remember really going for her gullet. I was so angry. I said, "I hate you so much. If only you knew how much we all hated you for what you've done. You've ruined the house. You spend Daddy's money, and what for?"
She puts Rain in her place. They eventually have such a falling out that her dad did not talk to her for 6 months. And at the point that she wrote the book, Rain still wasn't talking to her years later. So they had a big falling out. Now, this is a falling out that they had after the first falling out that they had at Diana's wedding. But we'll get there. We got time. This is the falling out they had at Charles's wedding. And this falling out is after Diana's marriage to Prince Charles. And even then there was so much tension that her father did walk her down the aisle, but Rain was not allowed to be seated with her father at the ceremony, nor was Rain allowed on the balcony with the rest of the family. So Anna described this falling out not as salacious like I did, but she described it as kind of a release. She said she was really happy to finally say everything that she'd always wanted to say. In situations like that, I do think it was wrong of her father to allow that to even happen. You shouldn't leave somebody out to dry. So even in that case, he should have mediated, and it doesn't sound like he did. Now, we're only at this point in the book. They are said to have mended fences and have built a really strong bond near the end of Charles's marriage to Diana. And we will get there, but right now this is the point in which she's sharing. Another random fact is Diana predicted her father's brain hemorrhage. She predicted it. She had a premonition while staying with some friends in Norfolk. And just out of the blue, she said she heard herself speaking, but it wasn't like she was the one commanding the words. She just heard herself say, "My father is going to have a serious illness. He's going to collapse. And it'll be something with the brain. And then if he collapses and dies on the spot, then of course he will die. But if he doesn't die on the spot, then he will live and survive." Now, this is interesting because that ended up happening.
I had a premonition that he was going to be ill, and I said, "I've got this strange feeling that he's going to drop down, and if he dies, he'll die immediately. Otherwise, he'll survive." Next day, the telephone rang, and I said to the lady, "That'll be about Daddy."
And it was. She was dead on. So here's the craziest part. When they all the kids went to the hospital to see John Spencer, because he's obviously in dire straits. He also had a tracheotomy and he couldn't speak. And Rain, his wife, took advantage of the fact that he couldn't speak and would not allow the kids into the hospital room. And Diana felt very strongly that she was not telling her dad, that Rain wasn't telling her dad that they weren't allowed in the room. So he probably felt like his kids just weren't coming to see him. That is very sad. And that is why when you bring somebody into your family and it's a blended family, you as a person who is mending all these people need to make sure that everybody is on the same page. That is your job. You don't just leave it to them to sort out, because a lot of stepmoms are, not all, but a lot of step parents are vindictive. And some people marry into blended families and resent the fact that their spouse has kids outside of the home. It's insane to me, but it's the truth. And again, a little communication would have gone a long way. She brings us up to her young adult life. And this is when she lived in a bachelorette flat with her friends. Diana worked as a nanny. She also sometimes would clean for these same clients. And she resented women with velvet headbands because they were kind of the snobs, essentially. She also taught a kindergarten class. When she married Prince Charles, she eventually had to retire or stop working as a teacher, but she really enjoyed that experience. This is where we'll stop in the recap of the book, because now we're going to get into the part where she meets Prince Charles, and now it's the beginning of royal life. So we will get to that in the next recap. But before we get out of here, I wanted to talk about, in just this small section alone, how many things are freaking similar or exact in some cases to Spare. It was so many things connecting immediately that I was listening to this and was like, holy crap. It was literally just the same thing over again. Wow. So first, Princess Diana hated the dark.
I hated the dark and had an obsession about the dark. Always had to have a light outside my door until I was at least 10.
That was a big part of Prince Harry's experience. Even at times, his father would leave the door open so that that Harry didn't have to sleep with the dark, like a dark room, because he was so afraid of the dark. Eventually, he got over that. But for his entire childhood, he was afraid of the dark. So was Princess Diana. She even painted the eyes of her stuffed animals to be luminescent and catch light and kind of glow in the dark so that she wouldn't be in complete darkness in her room. She was a people person and got along with everyone. So does Harry. Here's the funniest part. She said her brother Charles was way more studious and he was way more intelligent when it came to book smarts, but he was not a people person and he couldn't read a room. He wasn't a people person. Is that not Harry and William? William is said to have been very good in school and very studious, but he was a bully. And we do know that to be true, allegedly, now. He's not that well liked. He's not the people person, but Harry is. Harry connects with people. If you need evidence, look at the walkabouts, how Harry interacts with people. He picks up on vibes and he sends it back. He's very much a people person, whereas William, he's not as people oriented. Everybody's got their thing, but I just thought that was really interesting. Harry has made his life's work mental health focused. We know this. We've talked about it so much on this channel. Guess who else was interested in mental health? Princess Diana. She definitely had a number of initiatives with mental health as well as eating disorders, which we talked about, and I shared one of her speeches here. But also she said if she could, she would have studied psychology full-time in school, and she would weekly, when she lived in her bachelorette flat, weekly she would volunteer at a mental asylum. Thought that was interesting because all through college, I actually won an award, a Volunteer of the Year award, because I used to volunteer at Terrell State Hospital. I just thought that was interesting because Diana had a heavy focus in mental health. So does Harry. Also, Diana disliked her stepmother. They had an extremely tumultuous relationship, and she described Rain to be a calculated and strategic woman who basically stepped on her stepchildren to get to the dad. Who else do we know is like that? Harry and Camilla. They had a very tumultuous relationship. Harry, being a people person, he was able to always play nice, but he was very well aware of who Camilla was. Also, she was fiercely protective of her mom. When Diana just kind of let have on Rain, it was in defense of her mother, Frances. Harry defends his mother, Diana. Diana and her father were estranged for a very long time. Harry and his father are estranged for a very long time. Diana describes her dad in some ways as cold at this point in the book and kind of detached. And we do know that Charles is very much like that, as Harry has described it. Over the years, a lot of biographers and people who've reported on the royal family have said the same. I just find that so interesting how things are just so cyclical. Also, Diana adored her eldest sibling, while sometimes playing second fiddle to her. She would do chores for her. She would do anything to be near her sister. She just loved her sister, but at times she would be very laborious, vying for essentially her affection or approval through acts of service. And we do know that Harry and William had a very similar relationship. William really didn't want anything to do with Harry. Harry pretty much admired him and wanted to build a relationship, and William just wasn't interested. Even going to school and telling Harry, act like you don't know me. So I thought that was interesting. They both obviously came from divorced homes where the mom was mistreated severely. Diana obviously is Harry's mom, and she was mistreated severely by Charles and his mistress, Sis, and his family. Diana's father mistreated his mother severely until his mother ran away. And Diana even describes in the foreword considering running away in the same way that her mother did, but she knew it was impossible because she had given birth to the heirs. She could never do it. We also talked about they both felt like the spare. Harry was actually the spare in the royal family. Diana felt like second fiddle. She was third in line in her family and their nobility. And because she wasn't a boy, she was allowed to do and be whatever she wanted to be. And she wasn't as scrutinized as Charles, who was the only boy in a family of 4 full of women. Neither of them did well in school, but they were both very athletic. They both loved swimming and diving. They often pulled pranks and hijinks, and they both loved animals. Diana, throughout her entire life, had all kinds of pets. She had rabbits, she had guinea pigs, she had pets all the time. Even at school, she would bring pets. She had guinea pigs and won an award for the best guinea pig. And Harry, he said he cannot stop kissing Guy. Like, he loves animals. Remember, he swam out to swim with the seals. He loved elephants. Like, he explored elephants and all. Like, it was just so interesting to hear how many things were connected. So they both loved animals. Just this portion of the book, I'm already still pulling in all these similarities with Harry's story and Diana's. I'm so glad we decided to do this recap because it's giving so much insight, as well as why which I already feel like I knew, but it's just giving more of a reason why Harry defends his mother the way that he does, because Diana didn't have it easy. Yes, she came from nobility, but Diana had a really tumultuous childhood and early adult life. And it's interesting how people try to gloss over that because she's the people's princess, the princess of hearts and the princess of Wales. But a lot of times people build compassion and empathy through their own struggling. And that's why she didn't have a whole lot of respect for the women who wore velvet headbands or women who basically leaned into their aristocracy and their privilege. She saw people beyond their situation and circumstances. She saw people and connected with people. She also made it a point to say that her father, John Spencer, made sure that they treated everyone with respect and with the same level of respect. She even said that he was such a stickler for them being respectful to people and treating people kindly that if they were invited anywhere, as soon as they got home, they were made to write their thank you notes same day. And that's a habit that she still has and she passed on to William. So that's all we've got for the recap today. This is only focused on Diana's early life, her early childhood, her time in school, and her pre-royal life. But when we come back for our next recap, we will be talking about Diana meeting Charles and the lead up into her royal life, as well as her early royal years. So I want to hear your comments on this portion of the book. What are your thoughts on Diana's early life, her early experience, and her childhood? I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts on the similarities thus far in the book? We will continue to document more similarities as we move through the book, and I definitely want to try and keep the conversation in the current space of the recap so that when people look back, they can read the current commentary based on what we're reviewing currently. But we have time. We will get to everything. So that's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another royal review. I really appreciate your participation and your support. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like this video, and I will see you next time. Bye.